Amid the romantic landscape of the Mediterranean, where the pristine white walls of Santorini reflect the sunlight like molten metal, a 17-year-old girl believed she was on a family getaway meant to mend old wounds. She ate ice cream by the harbor, forced smiles in photos posted on Facebook, and held her mother's hand while waiting for the ferry. For the first time in years, she felt something fragile and fleeting called hope. But just hours later, it all vanished like sand slipping through her fingers. No call, no goodbye, no explanation. Her parents left her behind in a foreign land with only a single note. "You're 17 now, old enough to survive." This isn't a story about her falling apart, nor is it a tale of vengeance or a grand dramatic comeback. It is the story of a fall that came without warning, and how a young girl with nothing but her bare hands rebuilt her world from the cold, unforgiving ground. A story of ultimate betrayal, of silent endurance, and of a return no one, not even her biological parents, could have foreseen. If you think the cruelest part ends at the beginning, brace yourself. Because beyond the silence lies a journey to reclaim dignity, freedom, and light, step by step, with the very hands that once trembled in the dark. Madeline Reynolds had never been the obedient daughter. At 17, she had failed math 3 times, gotten into a fight with a classmate in the girls' bathroom, and skipped school to spend hours in a nameless cafe simply because she didn't want to go back to class. Her mother, Lillian, told the neighbors that her daughter was just going through a bit of teenage moodiness. Her father, Edward Reynolds, chose silence, as he always had. But then one June afternoon, as the darkening sunlight spilled across the eaves of their colonial house in the Boston suburbs, Madeline found herself facing the unexpected 2 plane tickets to Greece, with no explanation, aside from an unusually warm hug from her mother and a brief promise. This trip is to start over. No brother, no work calls interrupting dinner, no family obligations. Just the 3 of them, mother, father, and daughter. For the first time in years, Madeline allowed herself to believe that maybe they were truly trying, not for appearances, not for expectations, but for family. Greece welcomed them with glaring sunlight and the salty scent of sea breeze. The first days in Athens were awkward, like 3 strangers trying to learn how to become a family. But little by little, the air grew lighter. They sat together eating gelato even though Madeline hated sweets. They visited temples where she feigned interest to please her mother. They took photos together for the first time in years, and her mother even held her hand while waiting in line for the ferry to Santorini. It was a moment that made Madeline wonder if things really were changing. Maybe this was a new beginning. She no longer heard her mother sigh at her report card or saw her father's cold stare when she came home late. Instead, there was the sound of waves, gentle laughter, and silence that no longer felt suffocating. In the hotel room at night, they watched Greek television together without understanding a word, yet laughed because even meaningless moments began to feel meaningful. Madeline, though still guarded, started to rewrite her idea of family not as strangers under one roof, but as 3 souls slowly finding their way back to each other. The night before they were to leave Greece, they sat together at a seaside tavern, golden light casting a glow on her mother's skin, her father's eyes reflecting the calm night. Her mother wore coral lipstick, the shade she saved for special occasions like weddings or back-to-school nights. Madeline noticed and remembered. Her father drank black coffee, no sugar, and said nothing throughout the meal. She wasn't surprised. That silence had long been familiar. But that evening, when her mother turned and gently said, "Tomorrow will be early, you should get some sleep," Madeline nodded, her heart filled with something as delicate as still water before a breeze, hope. For the first time, she didn't dwell on past mistakes or the quiet anger that had lived in her chest. She thought of the future, of possibly retaking math, of a graduation her parents would attend, of a family photo neatly framed in the living room. Beneath the Greek night sky, Madeline Reynolds believed she was no longer a burden, but part of something being repaired. She didn't know that just hours later, everything would fall apart faster than a candle extinguished before it's had a chance to fully burn. But in that moment, she allowed herself to dream. And that is what made everything hurt more later. The next morning, early sunlight filtered through the hotel room curtains as if signaling the start of an ordinary day. Madeline woke up earlier than usual, perhaps because she was looking forward to returning home with a different mindset, lighter, calmer, even grateful. Breakfast at the hotel was serene to the point of suspicion. Her mother wore an ivory linen dress, applied coral lipstick, and smiled as if it were someone's birthday. Her father sat silently with his cup of black coffee, not flipping through the paper, but not appearing annoyed either. Madeline ate lightly, mostly scrolling through her phone to respond to her best friend's texts, asking about the forced bonding trip. She didn't notice her mother's calculated silence or think much of it when she said casually, "We're just going to buy a few souvenirs nearby. We'll be back in 15 minutes." Madeline nodded, not even looking up. Everything felt so normal she had no reason to be suspicious. But 15 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. She began to feel uneasy but kept telling herself they were probably held up at the store, or her mom got distracted choosing ceramics again like last time. Another hour passed. Then two. She went down to the front desk, smiling awkwardly as she asked if they had seen an American couple leave recently. The receptionist furrowed her brows and asked for the room number. 302. They checked out this morning. In an instant, Madeline's world stopped spinning. She rushed to the third floor, swiped her keycard, but it no longer worked. The door wouldn't open. Panic began to rise like smoke. She knocked hard. No answer. A housekeeper passing by opened the door with a master key. The room was empty. No suitcases, no backpacks, no sign she had ever existed there. No passport, no wallet, no backup phone. Everything was gone, including the silver necklace she always left hanging by the bed. Madeline called both her parents. Their phones were off. Her messages wouldn't send. She paced around the hotel, then wandered the streets, calling their names in vain. By nightfall, she no longer had the strength to cry. That night, she fell asleep on a park bench, curled up, hands trembling, with nothing but a thin denim jacket to keep her warm. The next morning, she dragged herself to the American consulate, clinging to a sliver of hope that someone would help her. A woman in a navy blue suit with a tight bun received her, took notes, and typed briskly on a keyboard. Then she stopped, looking at Madeline with pity. "Your return flight has been canceled. Your name is no longer listed under your parents' insurance or emergency contacts. I'm truly sorry." Madeline couldn't speak, not because she was shocked, but because she was breaking. Her parents hadn't just forgotten her. They had erased her like tearing a page out of the book of their lives. That evening, she returned to the hotel, unsure why. Maybe to find a note, a slip of paper. Anything to prove that she hadn't been abandoned, that it was all a misunderstanding. But the only thing she found tucked inside her jacket pocket was a folded piece of paper with a handwritten message from her mother. "You're 17 now. Old enough to survive." No apology, no explanation. Nothing but a cold affirmation that she was meant to survive on her own, as if she were an object whose time had come to be left behind. Madeline walked out of the hotel lobby, past brightly lit shops and bustling crowds, but none of it meant anything. She turned down a narrow alley, sat behind a closed bakery, curled up like a child just betrayed by the world. For the first time in her life, she understood a bitter truth. It wasn't that they forgot her. They had deliberately crossed her out of their lives. The first 3 nights were a series of stomach cramps from emptiness and the night wind slipping through a coat too thin. Madeline curled up behind a metal dumpster behind a small bakery on the outskirts of Elia, where the scent of flour and cinnamon drifted each morning like a cruel joke to someone who couldn't afford bread. She didn't know the time only counted the sounds of garbage trucks, distant rooster crows, and her own trembling breaths every time she tried to sleep. She didn't cry anymore, not because the pain had lessened, but because even tears had run dry. On the fourth morning, before the sun had time to shine over the orange-tiled roofs, she was caught reaching for a still warm loaf of bread, forgotten on a tray behind the shop. Her hands were ice cold, her legs numb from sitting upright too long, and when a hand suddenly grabbed her wrist, her only reaction was to freeze. She braced for a scream, a call to the police, an ending that fit the script for an abandoned child. But what came next was entirely different. The woman looked at her, not angry, not harsh. Her gaze was so direct that Madeline felt like a glass pane being scanned for every crack. Her hair was silver tied back in a messy bun apron dusted with white flower hands rough and full of calluses. If hungry, the woman said in heavily accented English, then work. 4 simple words, neither pitying nor sentimental. But to Madeline, it was the first invitation after days of being rejected by the entire world. Her name was Lucia Moretti. 70 years old, living alone in the small apartment above the bakery she had run for 30 years. She didn't ask why Madeline was there, nor did she care. She simply handed her a dishcloth and pointed toward the sink. Piles of greasy, flour-dusted plates waited. Madeline didn't respond. She bowed her head and worked like a machine. That afternoon, for the first time in days, she had a decent meal, a crusty piece of bread with feta cheese and a few slices of tomato not given out of charity, but earned through real effort. Lucia let her sleep in the storage room among sacks of flour and a backup oven. A folding bed, a thin blanket, a dim light bulb. No one called it home, but for the first time since being left behind, Madeline felt safe. In the days that followed, she began learning mopping the floor, carrying flour bags, folding pastry boxes. Her hands were swollen and red, her back ached constantly, her mind always foggy from lack of sleep, but she kept going without complaint. Lucia never praised her, only nodded occasionally when Madeline kneaded the dough correctly. On rare evenings after the shop closed, Lucia would speak in her deep voice about a daughter she had lost, also had curious hands like yours always smelled of yeast. From that day on, Lucia started leaving misshapen loaves, the ones that couldn't be sold next to Madeline's folding bed, wrapped in brown paper sometimes with a piece of cloth lining. As if she understood that some children didn't need soothing words, but quiet, enduring presence. Every piece of bread, every nod, every time Lucia silently pressed a scarf into her hands on a cold night was a wordless kind of love. And though Madeline never said thank you, she understood she had been seen not as a victim, but as a person beginning again from the bottom of the world. In that kitchen, amid the smell of butter and the crackle of the oven, Madeline was no longer the abandoned child. She was a worker, and that was the first foundation of her rebirth. Madeline began each day before dawn, when the town of Elia was still wrapped in a thin veil of fog. She rose before the alarm clock she had mentally set, walking quietly through the hallway that smelled faintly of flour, to start her shift scrubbing floors, scouring trays, preparing baking sheets. The ovens warmed up just as the Greek letters began to appear on the product labels, and at some point, without realizing, she had learned to distinguish between regular flour, aged flour, and first batch. Lucia still didn't speak much, but her eyes always followed Madeline's every movement, not to supervise, but as a silent acknowledgement that the girl was trying. On rainy nights, she would leave a warm cup of tea next to the familiar misshapen loaf of bread, and sometimes just a small note. Don't forget to rub your hands. Live yeast doesn't like cracked skin. Small things like that to Madeline gradually became the clearest expressions of love, the kind she once believed she no longer deserved. After work, she sat beside the fridge that hummed endlessly, opening a battered old laptop she'd salvaged from the bakery's trash. It took nearly a week to fix it, 3 more days to hunt down the password to a nearby public Wi-Fi network in the town square, and hours to register for an online GED program using a new email address. No one told her to study, No one expected her to succeed. But in a world that had nearly erased her scoring higher on a math test than she did the day before, was a quiet victory witnessed only by herself. She studied under the dim yellow light, the scent of toasted sesame lingering between algebra lessons and sociology materials. Each time she completed a test, she whispered the score under her breath as a reminder, I still exist. Lucia never asked why a young girl hid behind a bakery every night, never touched the crumpled paper Madeline kept in her coat pocket, the note her mother had left with the words, You're 17 now, old enough to survive. But she always kept an empty space in the fridge for Madeline's food, and sometimes handed her an old notebook for recipes for budgeting for anything, not because she needed it, but because she understood that someone like Madeline needed to feel in control of something in her life. One day, by chance, while wiping down a table, Madeline picked up a crumpled financial newspaper left behind by a customer. Inside was an article about a shipping company undergoing restructuring with a simple analysis of stocks and the market. She didn't understand every word, but what she'd learned from GED algebra probability and trend recognition suddenly had a place to belong. She went online, searched how to open an investment account, looked up ticker symbols, and used all the money she had saved, about €200, originally meant for a new pair of shoes, to bet on the one thing she believed could change her fate: knowledge. 2 weeks later, the stock had tripled. It wasn't a fortune, but the feeling was immense. Not because she was richer, but because, for the first time in a very long time, she had done something with a tangible result that didn't require anyone's approval. In that moment, sitting quietly in the storage room, the screen blinking with confirmation and the sound of the oven echoing like a church bell, Madeline was no longer just an abandoned child hiding under bags of flour. She was someone learning how to take control of her own destiny through numbers, through bread, through solitude. And that for a girl who once believed she was only ever meant to be left behind was the beginning of an entirely different life. The first feeling of victory didn't come from money, but from a subtle shift within. When the stock price rose, the increase in Madeline's investment account didn't thrill her the way people often describe a lucky strike. Instead, there was a deep silence, as if the world had tilted slightly in her favor, not out of luck, but because for the first time she had chosen correctly. She didn't celebrate. She simply reopened her old Excel spreadsheet, added a new column, and began marking potential follow-up investments. The oven still rumbled in the background. The scent of cinnamon still lingered in the air, but what was changing was no longer the loaves. It was her heartbeat, steady, precise, no longer faltering from fear. Lucia once caught her staring at the screen, brows furrowed, the cursor jumping from tab to tab. So now you play accountant, she said, her voice laced with a hint of teasing, but no malice. Madeline didn't respond. She just smiled, typed in another compound interest formula into the spreadsheet, and continued studying. From that moment, she became obsessed, but in an orderly way. She watched hundreds of YouTube videos on financial investing, read poorly translated forums from English to Greek, saved spreadsheets from small companies around the Aegean coast, and scribbled notes in pencil on the backs of bread receipts. She found an old PDF file of Warren Buffett, a non-official translation full of typos, and read it 3 times in 1 week. Each time she read it, she underlined more, added more notes in handwriting as small as ants, as if she were memorizing a new language, the language of those who no longer let fate decide who they were. The next investments didn't always succeed. Once she bet on a green tech startup that collapsed in 3 weeks. Another time, she nearly lost everything listening to a stranger on a forum. But instead of retreating, she dissected each mistake like a surgeon searching for cause of death. Every misstep wasn't cursed as bad luck, but logged in a notebook. Don't trust advice without data. Always check market capitalization. Never invest when angry or sad. That notebook thickened page by page, each mistake becoming the foundation of someone rebuilding herself from fragments. When she started earning steady income, those first few euros carried no scent of sweat or yeast, and she knew she had crossed an invisible threshold. Not from poor to rich, but from victim to builder. She opened a PayPal account, then an e-wallet, then a small bank account in Naxos through a bakery acquaintance. Her name now linked to an account number, a stream of income, a tangible capability, was no longer the name crossed out in her parents' passport. She had her first client, a wine shop owner looking to optimize delivery costs, then a Swedish couple needing online investment advice, then a group of young people stuck in Greece on visa issues unsure where to start. Madeline wrote them a short guide and posted it under an anonymous account. Every read, every thank you, every message saying you helped me so much was a pat on the back she had once vaguely hoped to receive from her parents, but now she no longer needed it. Lucia never asked how much she made, but she sensed something had changed. One afternoon near Christmas, Madeline placed a new phone on the kitchen counter. "For you," she said plainly. A week later, a new espresso machine appeared next to the gas stove without a note. That month's gas bill was paid early by someone, and when Lucia asked, Madeline only smiled softly, hands still kneading dough with rhythm. One day, Lucia looked at her through the bakery counter window and said quietly, "You walk differently now, no longer like someone waiting for something to fall on her head." Madeline didn't answer, only nodded because she truly wasn't waiting anymore. She was walking, and this time every step was one she chose for herself. That morning, the sunlight was just as golden as every other day, but there was something heavier in the air, as if even the scent of sweet pastries couldn't mask the subtle yet unmistakable shift in Madeline's private universe. Lucia sat at the kitchen table, coffee cup in hand as usual, glasses slipping down her nose, flipping through a stack of old newspapers someone had left at the shop. Without a word, without any special gesture, she quietly pushed one of the papers toward Madeline, her finger lightly tapping a small box tucked in the bottom corner. Clearwater FL, Residential Property Foreclosure Notice. Madeline leaned in. She didn't need to read long to recognize the address. Every number, every street name, the zip code, they were etched into her memory like an old scratch that never faded. It was the house her parents had bought after abandoning her in Greece, the house they had once proudly called their new beginning. And now it was being foreclosed due to non-payment. She sat still for a long time after reading it, but inside there wasn't a drop of anger. No joy, no smug satisfaction. Just a quiet sense, as if the door the universe once slammed in her face had now creaked open on its own, waiting to see if she had the courage to walk through. Without saying a word to Lucia, she opened her laptop, entered the details, checked the legalities, read through the auction terms. Everything was clear, transparent. The house of Edward and Lillian Reynolds would be publicly auctioned in just under 3 weeks. And this time, the one with power wasn't them. The plane tickets were booked under the legal name of the consulting company she had registered in Greece. Northfield Consulting. A name that bore no memory, no link, no trace. She and Lucia flew to the U.S. as representatives of a foreign firm looking for reinvestment properties. No one questioned them. No one noticed. In the parking lot outside the Pinellas County Administrative Building where the auction was held, she found herself among a crowd of people in khakis and pastel polo shirts holding iPads and flyers, faces that wore the casual calm of those who hunted houses like they hunted opportunities. No one knew who the young woman with the steady eyes standing next to the silver-haired lady was, nor could they have imagined she was the piece of the past those homeowners had tried to erase. When the auctioneer called out the address, Madeline's heartbeat was steady, like the ticking of the kitchen clock back at the bakery, measured and cold. Each time someone raised their paddle, she whispered a number into Lucia's ear, and that aged hand lifted the bidding paddle with an oddly calm ease. Another man, middle-aged sunglasses on, clearly had his eyes on the same property. He looked at them with thinly veiled disdain, as if they didn't belong in this arena. But each time he raised the bid, they responded with unflinching precision. When the gavel came down and the word sold echoed through the lot, it was like a clean slice severing the past. They had won. The house now belonged to the one who had once been erased from it. Lucia said nothing as they left the lot. Neither did Madeline. They simply sat in the car looking toward the temporary whiteboard that announced the new owner's name would be revealed within the week. Madeline didn't smile, didn't sigh, didn't break down. Instead, there was a silence like the surface of water before a heavy rain. A kind of profound control, not for revenge, but to reclaim the ground where she had once been cast out. As the afternoon shadows stretched across the pavement, she opened her phone, typed an email confirming ownership to the city clerk's office, then leaned back in the seat and closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she knew one thing for certain: the past no longer had any hold on her, because from this moment forward, every door she stepped through would be one she had opened herself. The call came on a rainy afternoon while Lucia was hanging tablecloths to dry, and Madeline was reviewing the renovation expense sheet. On the other end was a male voice, polite but cold, the legal representative of Edward and Lillian Reynolds. He said her parents wished to meet face to face with the new owner to negotiate, to explain, to seek a more humane resolution. Madeline simply said yes, her voice light as air, and chose a small real estate office on the outskirts of town as a neutral meeting place. She arrived 10 minutes early, wearing a navy blue blazer, hair tied high, dark sunglasses covering half her face. She wasn't there to hide, she was there to force them to see. Her parents walked in 2 minutes late. Her mother came first, her figure smaller inside a loose beige cardigan, wearing oversized sunglasses, the kind she used to cover puffy eyes after arguments with her husband. Her father followed, clutching a worn leather file to his chest like a flimsy shield. They didn't recognize her. No glance, no startled reaction. Just a slight nod as they sat across the meeting table, preparing to say whatever they believed would convince some anonymous buyer. Until she took off the glasses. The silence that followed was sharp as a razor. Her mother froze, lips parting slightly but producing no sound. Her father blinked twice and looked down, his gaze retreating like a schoolboy who just lost his report card. Madeline didn't wait for them to speak. "You left me in a foreign country with no money, no papers, no goodbye." Her words held no resentment, just the tone of a factual report. Her mother swallowed hard, her voice almost a whisper. "We thought you'd hate us less if we didn't say goodbye. It's just, at the time you were so unstable. Everything was falling apart and you weren't a child anymore." Madeline finished, but not calm enough to be kept around. Her mother nodded faintly, eyes now beginning to glisten. "We thought it was for the best. You don't understand." "No," she interrupted, "I'm here. Because I understand." Her father remained silent. Not until she looked directly at him and said, "You didn't object. Not once. You let her do it. You let her erase me." He opened his mouth, then stopped. His hand gripped the edge of the file tighter. At last he spoke, barely above a whisper, like a blade dragging across old gauze. "I didn't think you'd survive." And Madeline, calm as if she'd just heard a weather report, stood up and slid the printed proof of ownership across the table toward them. "Then you were wrong," she said, "because I didn't just survive. I now own the house you live in." Her mother broke into tears. Not the guttural kind born of regret, but the theatrical weeping she used when she ran out of excuses, but still wanted to save face. Lucia stepped in from the hallway, clipboard in hand, nodding politely but firmly. "We'll need the keys within 30 days. The official relocation plan will be sent out tomorrow morning." She placed an envelope before them, legal instructions concise and non-negotiable. Her mother turned to her, eyes, red, voice trembling. "We're your parents. You can't do this to us." But Madeline didn't furrow her brow, didn't blink. "No. You were My parents. And you made your choice. Her mother collapsed into the chair and her father stared down at the table as if he were sitting in a final exam with no idea how to answer. When Madeline stood and turned to leave, a faint voice called out behind her, "Why, after all these years, why come back now?" She stopped. Didn't turn, didn't waver. She left behind a single sentence, gentle, ruthless, effortless. "Because I didn't need you to come back. I just needed you to know I did." And the door closed behind her as decisively as they had once closed her out of their lives, only this time it was her hand on the handle. The old house was handed over on a softly sunlit morning with rays slipping through the slanted coconut trees by the porch and casting shadows on the yellow peeling paint of the walls. Madeline stood before the familiar door that had once symbolized everything she wasn't allowed to return to. There were no trumpets, no dramatics, just a quiet patch of land that had silently borne witness to wordless farewells and irreversible choices. But this time it was no longer a prison of memories, it was the foundation for something entirely new. She didn't restore the house to live in it. She transformed it to give it away in the same way she had once longed for someone to catch her when she was thrown off the edge. The floors were replaced with warm laminate, the walls repainted a gentle ivory. The Live Laugh Love sign was removed without ceremony, replaced with bookshelves, picture frames, and folded blankets tucked into every corner of every chair. The living room became a shared space with a soft sofa, a compact kitchen, a new fridge, and even a wall of handkerchiefs that Lucia had collected over the years. The master bedroom, once the place where her parents avoided each other's gaze in silence, was now a dorm-style room with 2 bunk beds, new mattresses, pillows scented with lavender, and individual lockers for each girl. Lucia called it the second door because, as she said, some people never had a first one in their lives. Every detail was carefully chosen not to impress, but to make someone feel like they belonged. The girls Madeline planned to welcome here weren't acquaintances, weren't relatives, and owed her nothing. They simply had one thing in common with her: they had been abandoned without explanation. Lucia taught baking every Wednesday afternoon. There was no blackboard, no curriculum, just flour yeast and time. The girls sat around the kitchen table, hands still trembling from the fear of touching anything that might resemble stability, listening to Lucia say, "You don't have to get it right. You just have to try again." Madeline didn't interfere much. She worked in the background, organizing documents, editing online lessons, anonymously sending money to other shelters in Florida, places she knew still housed children labeled troubled, and quietly pushed out the door. She didn't put her name on any gold plaques, didn't go on television, didn't tell her story on social media. She simply chose to live as though every step she took was a silent answer to those who once asked, "How will she survive without us?" The first week, only 6 girls came. 2 didn't say a word. 1 couldn't lift her head. Another broke into tears upon receiving a new pair of socks. Lucia just smiled, never rushing, never questioning. She simply placed a tray of unbaked bread on the table and said, "Let them breathe first. Everything else later." Madeline stood by the window looking out at the backyard, once a laundry line, now a garden of mint and sage. She saw the kitchen light spilling through the window, heard soft laughter, smelled sweet pastry rising in the air. She didn't need to ask, "Is this a home?" She knew it not because her name was on the deed, but because there was light in every window pane. Soft music humming from an old phone, someone brushing their hair in front of a mirror, someone dozing on an armchair, and for the first time in a long while, Madeline knew for certain she was no longer alone. No longer defined by the old scars. She had turned the very place that once rejected her into a beginning for others. And that, more than anything, was forgiveness without ever saying a word. The first night the house was fully lit was in spring, when wildflowers began to bloom along the fence, and the scent of lemons blended with sugar drifted from the back kitchen into the yard. Madeline stood under the porch roof where she used to sit, waiting for her parents to come home holding a cup of ginger tea, brewed by Lucia, her eyes tracing the light from each window pane. She no longer saw the image of the 17-year-old girl who had once been left behind. Now in the house that once symbolized rejection, she saw a girl folding blankets on the sofa, another cleaning the mirror, a child reading under the soft yellow light hair tied crookedly mismatched socks on her feet. No one asked her what she had been through. No one needed to know who her parents were. They only knew that in this place there was still warm bread on the table, dry towels on the rack, and someone who always left the porch light on after dark. Madeline no longer needed to tell her story because those who lived in this house already understood it not through words, but through the way she laid each brick attached, each doorknob selected, each soft pillow, as if she were quietly mending something once torn. No one asked her for forgiveness, and she didn't need to say she had let go. Forgiveness sometimes isn't an action, but a decision to keep building something good without using anger as a foundation. And though she hadn't asked for it, attention still came. A post from her parents going viral online, accusing her of being an ungrateful child, a family asset thief. They claimed she had been misled, that she had returned to destroy. Their sharp words tried to reopen old wounds, but this time, they didn't land. Lucia asked if she wanted to respond, but Madeline simply shook her head, continuing to write down a new recipe for the second bakery they were preparing to open. "I don't need them to understand," she said. "I just need to keep doing it right." Inside her, that old Madeline still existed, the girl who slept under a tin roof behind a bakery, clutching the denim jacket with the cold paper tucked in its pocket. But now she was no longer a source of pain, but a part of memory, quiet, resilient, unbroken. Every time she walked into a room and saw someone laugh for the first time, she knew she was doing the right thing. Every time someone asked, "How long can I stay?" and she answered, "As long as you need," she understood she was giving what she had once desperately longed to receive. No one could return her childhood. No one could redo what her parents had failed to do. But she could build a place where people like her no longer had to ask, "Is there someone who needs me?" That night, beneath the tree canopy in the yard, Lucia handed her a symbolic key, a small silver replica engraved with a daisy. "Because you've replanted this place," she said, her voice like the wind. Madeline smiled, accepted it, and turned to look at the house. Not to inspect, but to remember. To remember that she had come far enough, long enough, deep enough to know that sometimes what you need isn't an apology. It's the chance to prove you never needed someone to come back. You only needed them to know you survived and did more than that. Beneath the warm glow of the old porch lights, once symbols of rejection, now came the soft hum of laughter, the scent of baked goods wafting through the hallways, and the light footsteps of girls who for the first time knew what it felt like to be welcomed. Madeline didn't need her parents to understand, didn't need anyone to declare who was right or wrong. The only thing she needed was the peace of a place built from compassion and an unbreakable will. She had returned not for apologies or validation, but to prove that where others chose to discard, she chose to plant. If this story touched something in you, a memory, a pain, or just a yearning to be seen and heard, you are not alone. We can begin again, anywhere, from anything. And if you want to keep exploring journeys of survival, of extraordinary transformation rising from ruin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that might help you see yourself anew with eyes full of grace and courage. Because sometimes we are the second door we've been waiting for.